I'll give you $2 for that guy's ears if you'll cut 'em off.
$2? Why, that's a buccaneer.
It all began with the J-3, J-4, J-5, and a threatened tanker. Piper Aircraft was in trouble after the war. Piper's existing designs just didn't compete with the war surplus aircraft then available. Piper was deeply in debt. Piper had a choice: develop an aircraft which could compete, or lose it all. That meant using existing material, but less of it. Designed in 6 weeks, the Vagabond was smaller and used fewer materials. It was the beginning of the short-wing Pipers. The Vagabond was soon lengthened and became the Clipper. The Clipper didn't last long. It was underpowered, and the name was already in use by someone else. But the idea was a good one. A bit of additional power and a few other changes, and the Clipper became a Pacer. The Pacer quickly had a tricycle gear added. With a 125 horsepower Lycoming, the Tri-Pacer was initially offered as a variation of the Pacer. 125 horsepower was enough aircraft crash that there aren't too many still flying. The power was increased to 135 horsepower, then 150. Additional power gave better performance. Tri-Pacers make good basic cross-country aircraft for 2 or 3 people, but the range of the original 150 horsepower aircraft was limited. "36 gallons of fuel at 9 gallons per hour translates into about 3 hours of flying. There is an optional fuel tank which fits under the rear seat and extends this to almost 4 hours of flying time. It doesn't sound like a great deal more, but it greatly raises the utility of the aircraft. Production of the Tri-Pacers ended with the introduction of the Cherokee in 1961. However, the same airframe was produced in a 2-seat version as the Colt Trainer until 1964. The Colt used a 108 horsepower Lycoming, very similar to that used to power the 4-place Clipper in the late 1940s. But that's progress. Some complain that short-wing controls are stiff, and that's true, although the same could be said of a lot of vintage airplanes. The aileron control cable is routed over no less than 6 pulleys. If that weren't enough, the cable is also interconnected with the rudder behind the rear seat. Yes, the controls are a bit stiff, but this must be placed in perspective. The short-wing aircraft aren't intended to be acrobatic performers. Vintage aircraft almost always have high drag. There are drag wires on the horizontal stabilizer and struts on the wing. The alternative would have been a much more robust structure, which would only add weight. Drag isn't nearly as important at the speed short-wing Pipers fly. Some have felt the Tri-Pacer isn't very maneuverable on the ground. Not so. The short coupling between the nose gear and the mains, and the excellent nose gear deflection, make it easy to maneuver the Tri-Pacer in tight quarters. Pacers, Clippers, and Vagabonds won't maneuver quite as tightly because of the longer distance from the main gear to the tail wheel. Although the short-wing cockpit is only 36 inches wide, contrasted to 42 inches for the Cherokee, it seems more cozy than snug. Many have criticized the overhead trim crank in the short-wing Pipers, but this is a feature shared with early Cherokees and others. Sitting in the pilot's seat, pushing the trim crank forward pushes the nose down. Pulling it back raises the nose. Just about anything heavy or awkward is under the seat of a short wing. The brake cylinder, the master switch, the battery, and the flap handle come to mind. Why? Well, the front seat sits near the center of gravity. Putting heavier items on the center of gravity lessens impact on the weight and balance. Not a bad idea. Not all the short-wing aircraft have flaps. The Vagabond didn't. Clippers didn't. Early Pacers didn't. But Tri-Pacers do. Don't expect short-wing flaps to act quite like the flaps on a Cessna. Yes, they'll shorten a takeoff run. Yes, they'll reduce the landing distance. But they have a lot of drag. That means they can't be lowered above 90 miles per hour, and they will definitely slow the aircraft. With flaps up, release the brakes. At 55 miles per hour, drop half flaps and push the nose down. Off you go! Do this with half fuel and just yourself on board, if you like skyrockets. The gross weight of short wings gradually increased over the years. After all, the VAG was just a J4 Cub with shorter wings. As the horsepower went up, so did the load-carrying capacity. The airframe doesn't appear to have the structure to accommodate more weight, so don't exceed these numbers unless you want to be a test pilot. Despite rumors to the contrary, the Tri-Pacer can be stalled. Try flaps in an ascending turn. Tri-Pacers were new. VORs were just beginning to replace the then standard low-frequency 4-course radio ranging. The radios reflected this. A single low-frequency radio and a comm were all which was necessary. These were gradually replaced by a low-frequency radio and a VOR comm. Some of the short-wing Pipers have no electrical systems and thus can't easily power radio. Tri-Pacers featured a circuit breaker panel like the one shown here. One advantage is that although the Tri-Pacer has only a 30-amp generator, most modern radios consume a lot less current than their predecessors. This means the Tri-Pacer can accommodate more radios than it could 20 or 30 years ago. How long were they intended to last? In the late 1940s, there were few aircraft over 20 years old, and fewer still more than 30 years old. Over half the short-wing Pipers built are still flying, yet the aircraft hasn't been built in 35 years. What impact does age have on these aircraft? What problems have surfaced? Are parts still available? Surprisingly few problems have surfaced. Many of these are simply rusting of the steel airframe. All of the critical parts which one couldn't easily fabricate are still available. Probably the most critical is the wing strut. As lift raises the wing, it tries to pull the strut apart and away from the fuselage. The strut's attached to the fuselage with a strut fork. The original forks have breakage and cracking problems. The original struts aren't sealed. Water vapor can enter at the top of the strut. When the vapor condenses, it flows down the interior of the strut, where it is trapped at the bottom. Rust forms, weakening the strut. One day, during flight, a gust causes a little more wing lift than usual. The strut fails, and the wing rotates upward. The FAA considers the potential for this problem sufficiently serious to issue an airworthiness directive, requiring regular physical testing and inspection of the struts to ensure their integrity. A good alternative is the installation of sealed struts. This eliminates the requirement for annual strut testing and is probably a better alternative. The cockpit of most short-wing Pipers is surrounded by a steel structural cage, which contributes to aircraft strength and safety. Part of the cage consists of a steel channel welded to steel tube. The area between the channel and the tube didn't receive a coating of primer during construction. Rust was found on a few tri-pacers. The metal is installed vertically, and water can't get trapped on the surface, so it's not a common problem. It's something else to check when recovering. Moisture does collect along the bottom of the fuselage. Piper aircraft originally used aluminum wiring. Aluminum is lighter and less expensive than copper. However, aluminum wiring leads to poor engine starting and flat batteries. The battery box also uses a very crude electrical feed-through. There are STCs and kits available which install copper cable and solve these problems. No real brake problem exists on the short-wing Pipers, but they do reflect the age of the design. Really good brakes are a fairly modern development. Except for the last few aircraft built, short-wing Pipers use brake shoes and a master cylinder under the pilot's seat. Fabric is another area that reflects age. Probably all short-wing Pipers have been recovered at least once, and all must be recovered from time to time. Recovering is not as much difficult as it is time-consuming and procedurally tedious. Early aircraft were fabric covered to reduce weight yet provide a smooth exterior surface. These are some of the requirements for covering. Early aircraft used a wooden or metal structure, covered with whatever fabric was handy. Some say bed sheets were a favored material. It worked quite well, but sun soon rotted the fabric. Since planes rarely outlasted their fabric in those days, this may not have had major importance. As aircraft such as the Cubs lasted longer and longer, fabric life became more important. The process became fairly standardized using butyrate or nitrate dope and is still in use. Piper presented this process in a very positive way. The finish was said to be Duraclad plastic. Duraclad was Piper's trade name for butyrate aircraft dope over cotton. Aircraft dope is a plastic, though it isn't often thought of in this way. This is the finish which was used on Vagabonds, Clippers, Pacers, and most Tri-Pacers and Colts. The World War II era produced new, man-made fabrics. Could any of them offer greater strength, better durability, or longer life? Experiments used off-shelf polyester fabric and standard aircraft materials, including butyrate dope. A Tri-Pacer elevator was recovered with polyester. When the butyrate dope peeled, nitrate dope was used, which resulted in less peeling. An STC was issued for the process under the trade name Seconite. Another STC process is ENX. ENX also used polyester, but with different coatings. Carbon black replaced the silvering coat to block sunlight, and the finish is auto enamel. ENX is strong. As might be expected, the enamel is subject to cracking. A derivative of ENX, Seconite 7600 has emerged in recent years. Its advantage is ease of application and less toxic finishing materials. Another fabric replacement process is Razorback, which uses fiberglass cloth and aircraft dope. Critics point to additional weight and special care requirements of this covering method. Advantages of initial man-made fabrics seem to be overcome by their problems. A second generation of materials emerged to address these issues. Some of the principles of Seekonite developed Superflight, while another individual studied the limitations of the various processes and developed Polyfiber. Superflight uses Seekonite fabric and different finishes. Long-term flexibility is claimed. Polyfiber requires less stitching. Tautness is controlled by heat shrinkage. The basic polyfiber process does not develop a wet look. Enamel may be used as a top coat, but the potential for cracking then exists. Very few short wings remain which have not been recovered with one of these processes. It's desirable to remove the fabric and inspect the aircraft structure on reasonable intervals. Hangared short-wing aircraft recovered with a man-made material should easily meet this requirement. The FAA allows owners to perform preventive maintenance items, such as those scrolling by on your screen. There are some of these that may not be wise to attempt unless you're really good mechanically and have the specialized tools required. Get a copy of the Aircraft Parts Manual, Owner's Manual, and other FAA maintenance manuals. That way you'll know you've done the right thing. Shock the aircraft so it does not move. If replacing a main gear, jack the gear so the tire is clear of the ground. For nose wheels, tie the tail down so the nose is clear of the ground. The wheel is secured by an axle nut and cotter pin. Remove these and the wheel fairing support tube. The wheel now slides off. Deflate the tire and remove the bolts which hold the two wheel halves together. Remove the felt seal. Clean the felt seal in a petroleum solvent, such as Varsol. Then, soak the seal in oil. Remove the wheel bearings. Wash all old grease and dirt from them with petroleum solvent. Inspect the bearing for scoring, pitting, or flats. Replace the bearing if any are found. Reinstall the wheel bearing. Clean the wheel of all dirt and grease. Repack the bearing with clean grease. Reinstall the bearing seal. The wheel bearing and seal on the back side of the wheel must also be serviced. Replace the axle nut and wheel fairing support tube. Install a new cotter pin. Many of the things you do on your airplane will require you to replace cotter pins. Fortunately, this is both legal and easy to do. Be sure you have the correct size and type of cotter pin. Parts manuals don't always contain this information. Install the cotter pin with the head either up or towards the front of the airplane. Bend the end of the pin apart. Wrap it around the nut or surface it's securing, like this. Safety wiring takes practice. It isn't hard, but practice makes perfect. There are a number of gadgets on the market which are intended to make safety wiring easier. However, unless you do a great deal of safety wiring, they probably won't be worth the investment. An experienced mechanic can usually do high-quality safety wiring with locking pliers and a diagonal cutter. Short-wing pipers use hydraulic fluid in the nose gear oleo and in the brakes. Adding hydraulic fluid to the nose gear will be discussed later in this video. Use only Mill Standard 5606A hydraulic fluid. Do not use automotive brake fluids. Adding hydraulic fluid isn't a lot different from automobile brake system. Remove the nut from the master cylinder, which is located under the pilot's seat on newer aircraft. On older aircraft, the master cylinder may be on the firewall. Fill the master cylinder with fluid and replace the nut. And replace the nut. Repeat this process for the left gear. Spark plugs require several tools. As each plug is removed from the engine, inspect it for cracks, wear, and cleanliness. Champion produces an excellent chart to interpret plug condition. Clean the plug before reinstallation. A grit blasting tool is best. Plug gap doesn't change much once the plug is installed. If you install a new plug, Be sure to set the gap correctly. Coat the threads with an anti-seize compound. Start the plugs by hand. Torque to 30 foot-pounds. Rotate the position of the plugs for longest life. Most of the short-wing Pipers didn't come with oil filters, but kits exist to add the filter. Changing the oil requires running the engine long enough to warm the oil. A quick drain at the bottom of the engine allows easy oil removal. Remove the oil screen from the bottom of the engine and check for debris. Different engines have the screen in slightly different locations. Flush the screen, reinstall, and safety it. Do a particularly good job on this safety wiring. Your engine depends on it. If any metal particles or unusual solids are found, consult your A&P at once. Replace the oil with 8 quarts of aircraft engine oil. Use the correct grade for the outside ground air temperature in your area. Most short wings came with an air filter like this. This filter removes dust from the air before it reaches the engine. This filter is cleaned by washing it in a petroleum solvent, soaking it in oil, draining it, and reinstalling it on the aircraft. As the filter gets older, it's hard to remove all the dirt. This will impact engine performance by limiting the amount of air available for combustion. A better solution may be a throwaway foam air filter. Bracket Industries makes an STC'd air filter of this type. But there is an airworthiness directive against the bracket filter, so it must be installed with care. Not all short-wing aircraft have batteries, but those which do install the battery in a box under the co-pilot's seat. Gas and fluids from the battery are vented through the bottom of the box. The battery should be serviced at least annually, but more frequently if battery conditions so indicate. After removing the battery box lid, remove the ground strap first. This helps prevent arcing between your wrench and the box while removing the battery. After removing the positive lead, lift the battery from the box. Remove all dirt and loose material from the box. A small vacuum may help. Make sure the gas and liquid vents are open and have no material lodged in them. Use a wire as necessary to open the vents. Remove any corrosion. Prime and repaint the box with battery box paint as required. When the box is clean and dry, sprinkle baking soda inside the box to neutralize any acid overflow from the battery. Clean the battery terminals and wipe off the top of the battery. Before reinstalling the battery, check the fluid level. If not at the correct level, charge the battery, then add distilled water. After adding water, recharge the battery. Dry the top of the battery. Brush the top of the battery with a soda and water mixture to neutralize any spilled battery acid. Wipe off the neutralized acid. Coat the battery terminals with petroleum jelly. Place the battery in the aircraft. Tighten the battery bolts. Check a bolt torque table or data for your battery for the correct torque limits. Place the cover and you're done for several more months. Perform a common sense inspection for the condition of the seat belts. If damaged, they must be replaced, not repaired. Car seat belts may work, but they aren't legal. The FAA allows simple repairs to fabric and refurbishment of decorative coating. Simple damage is the sort of thing that happens when a small hole gets poked in the fabric. Simple fabric damage has no structural impact and doesn't require fabric stitching. Refurbishment and patching is very dependent on the fabric used. Find out what you have Get the manufacturer's directions and follow them carefully. Refurbishment is the addition of a top coat on the existing finish. You can usually get this information from your logbook or from 337s. Use caution. Extensive rejuvenation can add significantly to an aircraft's empty weight. That would require new weight and balance calculations. Aircraft upholstery techniques are essentially the same as those used in cars. However, material must meet FAA flammability tests. Various vendors offer material which meets these tests. The simplest but most expensive approach is to use upholstery already cut for your aircraft. Don't use automobile upholstery unless you can prove that it meets FAA flammability requirements. Installing upholstery is not trivial, since it can interfere with control movement in a short-wing aircraft. It's theoretically legal to replace shock cords as a part of preventive maintenance, but it may not be wise. It can be a challenging and even dangerous process. When the aircraft main gear splays outward excessively, it's time to replace the shock cord. Expect to do this about every 5 years. The aircraft must be blocked so it cannot roll, and the aircraft placed on jacks so the gear connected to the shock cord can swing free. After removing the seats, remove the bolt holding the top of the shock in place. This must be done inside the aircraft while it is on jacks. A hammer and drift will likely be required to remove the bolt. Crawling under the jacked aircraft, remove the bolt which holds the other end of the shock in place. The old cords must be removed from the shock, which may require cutting the cord. Installation of the new cords, 2 are required per shock, requires a special tool and considerable force. Aircraft still jacked, install the top end of the shock assembly. Crawl back under the aircraft and move the gear back and forth until the lower bolt can be replaced. It can be done. It is potentially dangerous. It does require special tools and not a little patience. Replacing hydraulic fluid in the nose gear is harder than replacing it in the brake cylinder. To do it right requires a special tool. But you can do it in an emergency with only a conventional air compressor. First, raise the nose of the airplane by tying the tail to the ground. Release the air in the nose strut. Remove the valve core. Add Mill H6606 hydraulic fluid to the strut and work into the lower portions of the strut by pumping the strut up and down. This is where the special tool is needed. In excess of 1,000 pounds of air pressure is required to fully inflate the nose strut. This requires an air compressor and a high-pressure air pump. With the tail released, pump the nose until about 3 inches of chrome strut are revealed. Voila, you're done. An alternative approach is to leave the tail tied down and inflate the nose strut until it contains as much air as you can force in it with a conventional air compressor. Release the tail and the nose will drop, leaving some strut chrome exposed. The FAA's official position is that any modification to a certified aircraft requires approval by the FAA. There are 2 ways to get this approval. In general, a simple modification doesn't potentially affect safety or flying characteristics and does not require engineering review. STCs are the formal path to get approval for a modification to be made to several aircraft of the type or for a complex modification. There are many STCs. These are some of the most common. The original battery cables are aluminum. They weigh less than copper cables, but don't work as well. Additionally, the battery box feed-through is poorly designed and depends on a rather flimsy braided cable and bolt arrangement. An STC exists to replace the aluminum cables with copper and a much improved battery box feed-through. An oil filter is a very useful addition. This unit mounts to the firewall. Oil will last longer and engine life will be improved. Be ready for sticker shock. There are numerous fuel tank modifications. Some add tanks already present in other models. For example, a tank is present only in one wing in some Colts. Other fuel tank modifications add more capacity to the rear seat tank, or add yet additional tanks in the outboard wing section. STCs exist to install a 180 horsepower engine on later models. The basic aircraft is too draggy to get much airspeed improvement from this, but climb rates are dramatically improved. Many STCs are trade-offs. Carrying capacity or ease of flight is traded for performance. One of the most popular modifications is a conversion to conventional gear. The resulting aircraft can be slightly lighter and have better climb and airspeed performance. Crosswind performance is reduced. It's much more susceptible to a ground loop. This is a good, useful modification, but some modern pilots may not be completely comfortable with the conventional gear. Most owners find it easiest to have an existing STC installed or to obtain the help of an IA when seeking field approval. Here are some of the reasons short wings are so much fun. Whether you fly a VAG, Clipper, Pacer, Tri-Pacer, or Colt, you're sharing in the really great years of aviation. We hope you've enjoyed being with us the last 30 minutes. See you at the airport.